Taking a Walk.
Bowen had hired for his division, which was autonomous. He ran that separately from the rest of MCA Records. He hired Emery Gordy, Tony Brown, and David Hungate as A&R people and told them, okay, you're hired, now go out and sign whoever you want to. And Tony and Emery said, we want to sign Steve Earle. And he said, anybody but Steve Earle.
Welcome to the Taking a Walk podcast where Buzz Knight talks with legendary artists, storytellers, and icons to hear their stories behind their music. Today, Buzz is with a true American original, Steve Earle, Grammy-winning singer-songwriter, fearless storyteller, and musical outlaw. Steve's career has spanned decades, genres, and generations, from the back roads of Texas to the streets of Nashville and New York City. Steve shares his stories behind the music and his most beloved songs, the lessons he's learned from his heroes, and how the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other keeps him grounded and creative. Steve Earle's hitting the road with 50 years of songs and stories summer tour this summer, coming to a city near you. And he joins Buzz Knight on the Taking a Walk podcast right now.
Hello, Steve Earle. Thank you for being on Taking a Walk.
It is good to be here.
If you could take a walk with somebody living or dead, who might that person be? And do you know where you might take that walk with them?
Ram Dass, because I knew him a little to the end of his life, and he couldn't walk by the time I met him because he'd had a pretty catastrophic stroke, but he was still Ram Dass. And it was kind of a big deal for me because I read Be Here Now when it came out. And so for my 60th, it was always a big deal to me, but I'd never managed to sort of put any sort of daily spiritual practice together, even though I tried. I'm an old hippie, and then as a person in recovery, it's something else that you're supposed to do. And I just didn't manage to do that until for my 60th birthday, my manager, who had known Ram Dass for a while, took me to Maui to a small retreat at RD's house, and I met him finally, and I started going to Maui every year for the last few years of his life, and then got there just a few days after he died in 2020, and so missed that one. And there was another time that we couldn't see him because I didn't get to see him or Willie. Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson lived in Maui as well, and I'd visit them. But when you show up with a snotty-nosed kid, you don't go visit the octogenarians, who all my friends in Maui were. So it was something that really important to me, and it did get me going on a daily yoga practice that's continued to now, and and walk in probably in Maui. I haven't been back to Maui since Ram Dass passed away, and I'd never been before I went to that conference. I'd never been to Hawaii. And somebody asked me one time, like, why do you go to Maui? Why don't you go to the Big Island? Maui, that's so 70s. I said, well, I'm pretty 70s. And plus, Ram Dass, Willie Nelson, Chris Christopherson, that was my reasons for a pilgrimage to Maui. And Ram Dass used to go swimming once a week at Kihei, and I used to stay over by there. And so I always, wished that I could have gotten there for that. And it just never quite lined up. And because it was right in front of the hotel where I normally stay, but I was just never there when it worked out on the day when they were taking Ram Dass swimming. And so I'd probably take a walk and then down to the beach to go swimming. That's what the walk would be.
That'd be pretty awesome. As somebody who lives in New York, a great walking city as well, do you have any favorite spots to walk in New York?
Well, I walk a lot of different routes. I drop my son off at school every day. He has autism, and he goes to a school called the Caswell School, which is in the Lower East Side. It's like kind of right where Stanton ends there, and so I live in Battery Park City, so that's about 3 miles. I can make it 4 miles if I take a long route. I lived in Greenwich Village for 18 years. I still buy my coffee there at Puerto Rico and coffee there, and so I'll reroute to the village to Bleecker Street, get coffee sometimes, and then walk straight out to the west side and down the Hudson River, and which is beautiful. When I do this rain or shine, no matter how cold it is. So I don't suggest that walk in January or February. I usually go straight to Chinatown that way, which is always Chinatown at 8:30 or 9 o'clock in the morning is fascinating. It always has been. Chinatown's funny because Little Italy shrank to a block. Chinatown did not. And in fact, they got some of what used to be Little Italy. That community's holding together, and it's still vibrant, and it's still, you'd think you'd gone off into another country every time you cross one of those blocks into Chinatown to this day.
The amazing part about New York is you just lose track of time when you're walking the streets and just looking at people and kind of clearing your head.
It used to be that way for me. I used to come here to chill out after tours before I lived here. Now I live here, so it's a little bit different. I'm watching the clock a little bit more, because I live here and work here and get my kid to school, and I come back and I just hammer trying to get something done before he gets out of school in the afternoon, like every other single parent in the world.
So we're going to talk about you going out on your long run of a tour. We'll touch on that, but I wanted to mention something. Charlie Reed from the Proclaimers, he says that your album, Guitar Town, was, at this time when he said it was the best record of the 1980s, in his opinion.
Well, they ended up recording, My Old Friend the Blues, which was from that record. That ended, my luck was on the record of theirs that sort of found a new life after they had a hit from it. That was on Sunshine on Leith. And it's funny, and Craig's daughter showed up at my songwriting camp one year when she was 18 years old. And she's like, she's really, really, really good. So I've known those guys a long time, and I appreciate that. But I was a big fan of theirs from record one.
What was the Guitar Town session like, the whole creation of that? What can you tell us about it?
It was weird because I've been in Nashville for 13 years or 12 years, but when we started it, I'd had one record deal that I got just by default. I'd tried to get a record deal for years, and I just missed. I was sort of a baby in what people think of as the outlaw movement, and then the record deals kind of dried up pretty quickly on that. They wanted control again, and so maybe I just wasn't good enough, but. There's some songs I still play that were written back then. That's part of the point of this tour. But, by the time I'd been through a couple of publishers, I'd been on Epic Records for a minute. I had a 3-piece rockabilly band, and that finally got me a record deal of all things. And I didn't think that I would be doing that for the rest of my life, but it was sort of fun. And first time I ever played electric guitar was in my late 20s when I had that band. And then those singles we released at Epic didn't work, so they dropped me. And then I signed to a publishing company that belonged to the Oak Ridge Boys called Silverline Gold Line, and a gentleman named Noel Fox, who had been the bass singer of the Oaks back when they were a gospel group before they went secular. And Noel was a song guy, and he just told me, I'd been, when Justin was born, I started panicking, trying to write songs I could get cut, and I had very marginal success with that. A few people covered my songs, but not very many, not enough for it to really turn into a career. And none of us, my crowd of people, went there to be staff writers for the rest of our lives. We were singer-songwriters. We wanted record deals. And Noel believed in me. He told me to go write a record. I went out and saw Bruce Springsteen, the E Street Band, on the Born in the USA tour. He came out and opened with Born in the USA. I went home and wrote Guitar Town and started writing an album. And there was only one song that wasn't written in that few months before we actually recorded Guitar Town that I took from, it had been a couple of years earlier, and I played it with the rockabilly band. That was Fearless Heart, because I thought it was just such a good song. I didn't want to leave it behind, and it wasn't that. But I didn't go back for any of the songs that I'd written over, the 12 or 13 years before I got there. I did record some of those songs later on Train to Comin' after I got out of jail. I recorded a few of those songs, and those are the ones that you're going to hear on the tour this year. Those are the older songs that I still play. But the sessions were, they were pretty disciplined. We were doing different than Nashville was doing when I first got there. They catered, and everybody just stayed in the studio and ate there. And we worked, at least 2 sessions a day. We worked from, usually noon or so till pretty late. And once the tracks were done, we work even later sometimes. It was just one of those things. That's one thing I don't do anymore. I don't stay in the recording studio till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning anymore. But we discovered, I think when you're younger, you think you finally turn out later that you throw away most of the stuff that you do when you're too tired anyway. So it's one of those things. And most of the best stuff gets done in the first couple of takes or the first couple of hours.
Did you ever do any work in your time in Nashville at the infamous Quonset Hut Studios?
No, I never recorded there. It's the Quonset hut. You can still see the shape of the Quonset hut itself. A Quonset hut, for people that don't know, is, if you've ever seen Gomer Pyle, those structures that they used for barracks in that Marine camp. The Quonset hut was invented as a I guess within the military, to be a structure that could be thrown up quickly, but was really sound, stood up to wind, stood up to other things, pretty well. And it was basically, Owen Bradley got the idea. There's a sort of a theory in studios that you don't want parallel walls too close to each other because it's what they call a standing wave. And a Quonset hut is one long curved wall to ceiling, just like a tunnel. And so there are no parallel surfaces unless you put some in it. So that was the idea. He thought it would make a perfect recording studio. And so he bought one, put it on Music Row, and built a recording studio in it. Then he sold that to Columbia Records, and they built their building around it. And I can show people, you can drive past the Sony building now in the back, and you can still see the crack where two buildings are sort of together there, an annex. You can see the curve at the top of the Quonset hut in between them, and because it's sort of what connects the two. That long ago got turned into offices. It was still a recording studio when I got there. Billy Sherrill was ensconced there and was still recording there when I got there in 1975, but I never got to record there myself.
As an obvious student of the greats of Nashville, how does a song such as "I Saw the Light" by Hank Williams makes an influence on somebody like you?
Oh, I don't know. I think there's gospel songs like that. The first person I knew that wrote gospel songs was Townes Van Zandt, and which seemed, his reputation, it seemed incongruous. He wrote one called Two Hands, which is a very traditional up-tempo gospel song, and one called When He Offers His Hand. They're both on the same album. And, he wrote them for his mother. That's why he did it. I've written a couple. I've written one Christmas song. It's not really a gospel song, but it is a Christmas story that does have to do with what Christmas is about. It's called Nothing But a Child. And I've got a gospel song that I'm pretty proud of. That's actually called Tender Mercies. That's in this musical of Tender Mercies that I'm working on right now. It's just one of those things. Gospel music was always such a integral part of country music. There was always a gospel song in every country show, and so it got ingrained. And Why Me, Lord? That's still one of my favorite. And that's, you would call that a sacred song or a spiritual song. Gospel is actually, and I know way too much about gospel when it comes down to it, because the roots of rock and roll are also found there. And I wrote for a company that belonged to the Oak Ridge Boys, and I've learned the history of all that from them, at least from the white gospel side, and that's connected to the black gospel side. And I knew other people in Nashville that were involved in that kind of gospel music, and it always fascinated me.
So I was programming rock stations when Copperhead Road came out,
right?
And it really was super cool how it stood in between a Rolling Stones song and a Jimi Hendrix song, and really worked fabulously. We absolutely loved that when that came out, and still love it. Can you take us back to that time with the creation of that certainly great project?
I started out, when I made Guitar Town, I wanted to make credible country records. And I never saw that much difference between country and rock and roll, not the good stuff anyway. So Guitar Town and Exit Zero, I was definitely trying to do that. By the time Exit Zero came along, Guitar Town was more successful, almost a little too successful, according to Jimmy Bowen, who ran MCA Nashville at the time. And Bowen basically, Emery Gordy and Tony Brown decided they wanted to sign me. I'd worked with Emery when I was on Epic. He produced the stuff that I did there, and Bowen had hired for his division, which was autonomous. He ran that separately from the rest of MCA Records, and he basically hired Emery Gordy, Tony Brown, and David Hungate as A&R people. And David Hungate was the original bass player in Toto, and they and told them, okay, you're hired now. Go out and sign whoever you want to. And Tony and Emery said, we want to sign Steve Earle, and he said anybody but Steve Earle, because he knew me because the Rockabilly record I made, and he hated that because he kind of came from it, and I don't know what that's about, but I know he did come from that. Buddy Knox and he were partners and recorded together. And Party Doll, the A side, well, it was shipped as a double A, but Party Doll became the hit. And the other side is the song that Jimmy Bowen sings. And so he went on to be a really successful producer in LA and a part of that whole Oklahoma, migration to the West Coast that created a lot of great music. But he ended up in Nashville running MCA, and he just did not like me, did not like my voice, and did not want me on this record label. Guitar Town, he let them go ahead and do it because he told them that they could sign anybody they wanted to, but I had to go prove to him that I could sing. I had to go make a special demo, and I did it. And then, so he grudgingly let them sign me. We made the record. We put out one single that got into the 30s, which was Hillbilly Highway. And the Guitar Town just sort of exploded and radio stations jumped all over it. And they even tried to pull the plug on it at one point because they had a Reba McEntire record they were trying to get added. And you know how that works. So every label is going to get what they're going to get according to whatever their relationship with the programmer is. And they were told, no, we're getting phones on this. This is an active record here. And most of the stations wouldn't drop it. So that record went on. It became a #1 country album. And then I made Exit Zero, the second record. And, there's a lot of sophomore slump, but I don't think that was the case with that record. I'm pretty proud of that record. I think it holds up. There's still a lot of songs on it I sing every night. But I've had people that were working there at the time tell me that they were told absolutely not to work my record. So Copperhead Road I knew that I was dead if I didn't, I had a 7, album contract. I knew I wasn't going to get dropped, and I was 32 by that time. And I just knew I needed to do something. So I was in London producing a record, and MCA had started up an imprint that they'd had before called Uni. And Irving Azoff was running the whole record label at the time. And I walked up to Irving at a party and said, I want to be on Uni. He goes, he got this slice. And he didn't like Bowen very much. They didn't get along, but Bowen's division made money, so he left him alone. And I think I presented a way for him to fuck with Bowen. It was part of it, And I said, I want to be moved to Uni. And he got this look on his face. He said, Uni's not for country. Uni's for rock and roll and hip hop. And I said, I'll make a rock record. And so I went to Memphis to make it. I'm surprised I got to do it. I'm surprised they didn't just pull the plug right there. I think they could have. I don't, I barely understood the contract that I'd signed anyway. So I know it was 7 albums if they wanted it to be 7 albums, and 1 if they only wanted it to be 1. And the second one got made. So I went to Memphis. There was a rule about the type of recording equipment that you had to use because he owned all those the machines of that type in Nashville. That was part of it, but it was supposed to be about sound quality. But they had the same equipment at Ardent in Memphis, and I knew that because I was dating and getting ready to marry an A&R person at the time, and she had made some records over there, and I'd been over there with her. So I decided I wanted to go to Ardent and make Copperhead. It's a studio that ZZ Top records were made there. Parts of Led Zeppelin 3 were made there. It's still open. It's a very, very famous recording studio in Memphis. So I went to Memphis, made Copperhead Road to be a rock record, and we got played at rock radio someplace. There were some places that just still thought it was too country, up north. And I already had a pretty good thing going and one of the reasons that I did what I did is, even on Guitar Town, and especially on Exit Zero, WXRT in Chicago were sort of unknowingly inventing a radio format at the time because it got so wide open, and it became, the AAA format, and adult album, alternative, whatever order you put those words in. It's those 3 words. I never can remember what order it goes in. It was XRT. Convinced me that there was an audience out there, and I knew I needed to stay on the road. Luckily, my publishing deal ran out right as Guitar Town was #1. So they had to re-sign me on the better deal. So I got a big enough publishing deal that I could live on it. And I just put the money from the road into the bus and paying the band and stayed on the road. And I had a career from that point on.
We'll be right back with more of the Takinawalk podcast. Welcome back to the Takinawalk podcast.
Is there a genre you haven't touched yet that you would consider touching in the future?
Jazz, I guess, because a friend of mine told me after I made a bluegrass record, his mother started the station in Nashville. He's in some really good, I guess they would call alternative bands that were around, but his grandfather was Woody Herman, and he told me that he grew up, being a band boy with his dad, and he just, with his granddad, and he just said, you can probably make any kind of record you want to, except a jazz record. Don't ever try to make a jazz record. And I took that as a double dog dare, and so I have thought about it a few times.
I love that. That's fantastic. Any jazz players in particular that you admire?
Pretty old fashioned, like hard bop, and I love Woody Herman, and I love Stan Kenton and that kind of big band jazz. It's really jazz, and I love Birth of the Cool's probably my favorite jazz album, which is Miles and that relatively large band, and that's a really, really great record. But I like piano players are kind of, more than almost anything else. I love Bird, and I love Thelonious Monk, but I'm kind of, just Bud Powell. I listen to a lot of Bud Powell.
Have you checked out the Louis Armstrong Museum there in Corona, Queens?
I've never been out there, and I need to go out there because I love all that stuff. The early Louis Armstrong stuff, and I got obsessed because of a great book that Michael Ondaatje wrote called "Coming Through Slaughter," with the whole legend of Buddy Bolden, because we never really heard him play in his prime because they weren't making records when he was younger, and then he basically had mental health issues. He lived into the 40s, but he never was quite right when there was really a market for jazz, and he could have gotten a record deal. But according to Louis Armstrong and everybody else that was around, you are hearing Buddy Bolden. If you hear Louis Armstrong early on, and almost anybody else in town, he was the trumpet. He was a cornet player. He never owned a trumpet.
The museum is cool, but the house is incredible. It's got some great archival sound there and everything as you walk through.
In New Orleans, where I spent a lot of time in New Orleans, I was in a television show called Treme, and it was about, New Orleans after just characters in New Orleans after the storm. Mostly musicians. I played a street musician, but there's a guy there that I can't remember his name, but he collected a lot of jazz memorabilia. He's an academic. He teaches that stuff, that kind of New Orleans culture, but he owned Louis Armstrong's first cornet.
Oh, wow.
And it ended up, and that water was so toxic, was so caustic, that his house got flooded, and they opened the case and it just fell apart. It left only the steel parts, the valves, the hardened parts, but all the brass parts dissolved. That's how caustic that water was. It was in the streets. That's why all those trees along those boulevards going out, back towards the river, back towards the levees in the back. That's why all those trees died. All those big magnolias, all that stuff died.
Oh, I didn't know that. My God. Bluegrass is important to you. And
yeah,
I think it's an interesting time with some of these newer creators that have come on the horizon. I wanted to get
it's great. It's the biggest it's ever been, and
the Sierra Hulls and the
Billy Strings. Billy Strings, sells out multiple nights at Red Rocks and plays arenas and I don't, and I've watched all that stuff, and I did actually. Molly Tuttle's band backed me up along with Molly at Hardly Strictly Bluegrass last year, and it was a blast. I'm all for it. I'm gonna do. I've done a few bluegrass gigs. I played with Molly at Hardly Strictly last year. The Outlaw Cruise this last year. The Earls of Leicester backed me up for one show, which is that's it's one of those things that it's a Flat and Strudge tribute band that Jerry Douglas put together, and Sean Camp's in it, who's one of the best musicians I know, pound for pound, in that whole town, and a lot of great players in it. It was a blast. It was real live, holding on for dear life, adult bluegrass. It was fun.
Is there a thing you have to reconcile as far as the improvisation of bluegrass versus the, other forms that don't, I don't know, embrace improvisation?
Well, if you play it according to Monroe, then the lead singer is a guitar player, and guitar players in Monroe's bands never soloed. So I get off light with that. Now there are guys like Billy Strings that, but Bill's thing was no takeoff guitar. That was his deal. He just didn't do it. And because he wanted a guitar holding down the middle. And it allowed, the mandolin to stop playing rhythm. It allowed, guitar had to hold that down no matter what. And bass, I heard him one time. I got to be around Monroe a little bit the last few decades of his life, and I got to go sit in on a session. Emery Gordy, who's produced my stuff at Epic and was a co-producer on Guitar Town and Exit Zero, he was producing a Bill Monroe record, and I got to go. It was called Bill Monroe and Friends. And it was him with all these other bluegrass bands. He was finally kind of acknowledging he created a genre and playing with all these bands. Some of them people that he didn't talk to for years because they'd left his band. But he finally had figured out by that time, long years before that that's because he invented something in an American art form. And that's how that works. But he they were signing the time cards at the end of the session. Everybody signed it. And Jack Cook, who was Ralph Stanley, it was his band, right? And Jack Cook was his bass player for years. And so he had seniority, so he made him the session leader because you get double scale. And he was signing the card, and Bill was watching Jack Cook sign that card. And he elbows Emery and he says, "Emery, we don't pay bass players, do you? You can't hear them." So it's one of those things. He had this very, very dry, almost English sense of humor. It was pretty hilarious. Some people mistook it for something else, but he was really smart and really funny.
Somebody sent me the incredible performance there in Galway that was, it seemed like there was hundreds of thousands of people that were singing Galway Girl.
Oh, it was Mundy and Sheraton. And Mundy actually had the biggest hit on the Galway Girl that finally pushed it into Irish culture once and for all. Several years after my version and Sharon's version. My version and Sharon's version are the same thing, except the accordion's loud on the mix on her record. But yeah, and I wasn't around for that. It was people, trust me, I got that video forwarded to me a lot.
It must make you feel really great watching that. It's so joyous. I mean,
yeah, and it's also I got one from a friend of mine's class, and a school teacher friend of mine's class, and everybody's singing it, and it's one of those. And there are musicians that hate me for it because it's become such a part of culture. I also had a friend of mine who runs the Galway Traditional Music School. He's Mick Crahan. He's a whistle player. He plays the low whistle and penny whistles or tin whistles, whichever you want to call them, and some flute, but mainly he's about whistles. And he's an old socialist. He's like, he and I have a lot in common, and got to be really, really good friends. But he's like he teaches at that school, and he plays mandolin and guitar too. And this kid came in. He was about 8 or 9. He had a mandolin, and he said, "I want to learn to play the Galway Girl." And this is Mick telling the story, so I have his word. I only have his word for it. That this is how it went down. He goes, "I want to learn to play the Galway Girl." And he goes, "Well, first let's show you. Here's a G chord." He goes, "I just want to learn to play the fucking Galway Girl." And that was it. That's all he was interested in. I think he learned to play it eventually.
I want to talk about some causes that are important to you. Obviously, the Keswell School is one.
Yeah, well, I got a kid that goes to school there. Yeah. So anybody that's got a kid that goes to school is probably raising funds for it in some one form or another nowadays.
So you will do another show coming up later in the fall?
Yeah, we're going to do one. We're moving venues this year. We haven't announced it yet, but we'll be announcing pretty soon as soon as we get a headliner locked in. And
I know Better Than Jail is a equal justice organization that you support as well.
Yep. And I still am opposed to the death penalty. That was a core issue for me for a long time. I don't get directly involved with inmates anymore because that eventually led to me witnessing an execution, and I don't have it in me to go through that again.
Oh my God.
So
Yeah.
I try not to get too close to inmates. I feel bad about it sometimes, but I had about 11 guys that I corresponded with. They've all been executed now. And one of them, I witnessed that execution, and I just can't do that again. And you know, I was blindsided. He asked me, "How are you going to say no? It's a dying man's last request." And my guys weren't innocent. You know, innocent guys never wrote me. All my guys were guilty. But I'm opposed to the death penalty. I'm opposed to if the government kills somebody, then in a democracy, which we're barely hanging on to, but we're ostensibly a democracy, then I'm killing someone, and I object to the damage that does to my spirit. I'm not, you know, I'm trying to keep me from going to hell. I'm not trying to save anybody on death row necessarily.
Any other charities and causes you want to make mention of?
Autism Speaks, obviously, which funds a lot of the research into the causes of autism. In every city, there are local autism, you know, charities, and those are pretty near and dear to my heart. You know, American Civil Liberties Union. You know, I do stuff for them all the time. I've played their plenary every year, and it's like it's just it's one of those things that it's more or less the same causes that have been my causes pretty much all my life.
So you're heading out for a couple of months on the road here with these
3 months.
3 months.
3 months. 90 days, 69 shows in 90 days.
So people can go to steveearle.com and check out all of the dates.
It'll be there.
everywhere.
And yeah, we start in Decatur, Alabama, coming up in it's next Sunday night, actually, the 20 as we're taping this, the 25th, and it goes through till Labor Day weekend. And it's at Rhythm and Roots Festival in Rhode Island is the last show.
Any other venues that you played before that you'll be playing that are some of your favorites?
Yeah, there's some clubs, some theaters. There's a really cool art center in Grass Valley, California. I haven't played in years and years. And Utah Phillips lived there the last, few decades of his life. It's funny. Utah Phillips and Chuck Yeager ended up in the same place on the planet for the end of their lives, which I always thought was interesting. I'm playing the Calgary Folk Festival. That's with Reckless Kelly. I'm playing the Vic in Chicago, which I haven't played in years, which used to be sort of my home base in Chicago. And but especially the 90s, right after I got out of jail. But I haven't played there in quite a while, and I'm looking forward to that.
So, Steve, in closing, I know you're a big Yankee fan, and I wanted to ask you, were you ever a ball player, first of all?
No, I was the worst athlete in the history of Texas, and my brother played everything. My dad, held a record a high school record in the mile relay until he was, until I was on the planet, and it was broken when I was about 10 years old. But I was just terrible at everything. The baseball thing I was a Dallas Cowboys football fan. I just kind of quit watching American football. I don't know, several decades back. Jerry Jones started to piss me off. And so it was one of those things. I got tired of watching guys get hurt. I follow English Premier League soccer, football, that football in general, and the Premier League, because I produced a lot of records in England and I got kind of hooked, and I've been an Arsenal guy. But the Yankees thing started with my grandfather. He's actually my mother's stepfather, who mustered out of the Army in New York City and intended to stay here. But he was dragged back to Jacksonville, Texas, kicking and screaming because his stepfather died, and he had to go home and run the family hardware store because that was his mother's livelihood. So, but he came back a Yankees fan, and you only got the Yankees or the Dodgers on TV when I was growing up. That was it, the game of the week. So you were either in the middle of the country, if you had no baseball team, you were either a Dodgers or a Yankees fan. That's pretty. That the original America's team, that wasn't coined for the Dallas Cowboys. It was coined for the Yankees, and it was because of that period in history. So I was issued pinstripes when I was 6 years old. My first team was 61, Maris and Mantle and that record and that story. So, and I was a big Yogi Berra guy. I like catchers. Thurman Munson, Yogi Berra, those catchers are a big deal for me for some reason. They're the only player on the field that gets to see a whole baseball game. That's why so many of them become managers.
The tools of ignorance, right?
Yeah. Yogi Berra was such a character too. He said, "My favorite yogiism is when people die, you should go to their funerals, otherwise they won't come to yours." That's my very favorite.
Oh, Steve, thank you so much for being on Taking a Walk. Good luck on the tour, and I really appreciate you being on.
Thanks. See you down the road.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Taking a Walk podcast. Share this and other episodes with your friends and follow us so you never miss an episode. Taking a Walk is available on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts.